Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, or wherever you are, whatever. Yeah. This is like the greatest book ever written. Well, I suppose I'll start it off. Yeah, it was originally published in 2010 and it was republished by Penguin last year in October. And it was written by Thomas Ligotti, who you probably already know who he is now if you're watching this, but he's from Florida, I think, originally. He's 65 now, roughly. And because of the book club review on YouTube, I now know he has a high carb diet. More on that a bit later. Like people and their ad hominem arguments, man. Anyway, yeah, the book, it's a non-fiction book, and it's basically, it poses the question of whether existing is really worthwhile. And the answer is a resounding no. The arguments in it basically starts off with Ligotti kind of posing that question, and then it kind of goes more into if you're a kind of a more pessimistic viewpoint or disposition, then you'll probably feel ostracized by society and a bit kind of put on the sidelines and ignored. And that's kind of what hooked me in, to be honest. I mean, I am someone who's quite pessimistic naturally. It's just the way I've always been, really. And finding this book, although I will admit that I found it through True Detective, because falling in love with the philosophy, which is the best part of that show, and at the beginning part of it, especially the first few episodes, and falling in love with it from that, and I had to figure out how it was written, really, because I looked up Pizzolato, assuming that's how you pronounce his name, and the first thing I really found was that he owed a lot of credit to it because of the conspiracy against the human race. And just with that title alone, I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to get that. And I was quite stunned by how much was taken verbatim from the conspiracy against the human race, especially Russ Cole's rants, because they are basically all just taken. So yeah, it was a little bit surprising to not hear anything about plagiarism going on, but I suppose Ligotti, being the kind of reclusive person that he is, maybe he just didn't give a shit. And I think that's commendable if that's true. Especially nowadays, I mean, everyone wants credit for stuff that they didn't do rather than what they did. And I think in a roundabout way, it's actually made him, I'm sure he had a cult status beforehand, but with this book, he's become massive, really. I mean, a lot of people have heard of him now and know of his work, and I do have his short story collection somewhere. I have read most of it. Yeah, Sons of a Dead Dreamer, and I've enjoyed quite a lot of those. But there's something about this book that kind of speaks to me on a much more personal level, and I actually do keep it by my bedside table like a Bible, because sometimes I just have a day where I need to hear someone who I feel simpatico to, who gets it, who kind of, because there's too many people who would just look at you like you're a dog who's just tried to speak. And when you rant on about kind of the pointlessness of existence, or kind of how we don't have free will, I've had that many a time where just arguing pointlessly with people who don't really understand the concept of free will to begin with. So then when you're trying to explain that you can't possibly have it being human. But that's another argument for another time. I still think you might have a little bit of it, a tiny bit, but how often you can implement it is beyond me, really. I don't really think you have it. I'm a determinist nihilist, really. But you know, even being a nihilist is a contradiction in its own terms. So I don't like labels overall. I think they're kind of nonsense. Like, I am basically an anti-natalist as well, but I don't like the label because I think it's too, for the lack of a better word, non-exclusive. I'd say it makes you seem like you're so totally against something when really it's more of a personal thing for me. It's just like I choose not to breed and I won't ever breed. I'm fairly certain of that. You know, luckily I haven't had any accidents happen, but yeah, it's one of my biggest fears is becoming a father. And I think it's one of Ligotti's as well. So yeah, I'll go on to the book a bit more. He often mentions a guy called Peter Wessel Zapf, who was a philosopher, a very pessimistic philosopher as well. And one of the main things it kind of talks about is how we distract ourselves as human beings, and there's 4 main methods of doing that. The main, I think the first was isolation, which I'm pretty certain a lot of people adhere to in a kind of, basically that's just kind of like you ignore it. You ignore the kind of bigger questions about being alive, and you just kind of get on with the day to day. And I think because of once you've been at school for so long, if assuming you went, and after doing that for like 15 fucking years or whatever, then you come out of it and you're already psychologically trained not to think, ironically, because you've just been sitting on your ass for 8 hours a day. And then that's perfect, because then you can go out to the workforce and not think there as well and just get on with it. And that's basically so you isolate your own thoughts from themselves. And the second one is anchoring, which is a little bit similar, but it's more of a kind of cognitive dissonance, basically, where you believe one thing that is completely contradictory to another and have no problem with that whatsoever, which I've always had difficulty with. Ever since learning about it, I haven't really been able to stop thinking about this kind of idea that I'm believing stuff that directly contradicts other things. And that's basically stuff like, you know, God and country and the flag and morality and things like that, where you put a kind of metaphysical meaning into your own life to get through it. It's the kind of a little bit in the way Nietzsche would go on about how Christianity was flawed, because one of the main reasons it was so flawed is because it concentrates on an other world so much, and it's like, well, what about this one? What about the one we're actually fucking on? You know, isn't it a bit more important to concentrate on that? Maybe take a bit of responsibility for it. I don't know, instead of kind of hoping for this kind of pie in the sky notion that there's something else out there. I mean, even if religions got updated, I think they'd have a bit more credit, like with the kind of multiverse notion, which is an horrific idea, but if at least that is a bit more plausible instead of this kind of, you know, paradise where you just, for some reason, you never get bored of being in the clouds with God. Number 3 is fuck. I had it in my head. 1 minute. Distraction. Yeah, well, that makes sense. Well, to quote the book, to keep our minds unreflective of a world of horrors, we distract them with a world of trifling or momentous trash. The most operant method for furthering the conspiracy, it is in continuous employ and demands only that people keep their eyes on the ball, or their television sets, their government's foreign policy, their science projects, their careers, their place in society, or the universe, etc. Yeah, we're all guilty of that one, I think. We can't quite help it. It's much. But I suppose the main thing for me is, like, when you're a kid, you kind of think stuff that, you know, say take a sport like soccer or football, for example, and if you focus so much on that, it kind of feels like that's your meaning in a way. But once you figure out it's a distraction, it kind of, the domino effect on your mind is kind of astronomical, really, because you kind of see everything as a distraction after a while. And that's kind of one of the other arguments in the book, is that, yeah, you can piss your life away drinking or doing drugs or working on your career, trying to get as many lovers as you can, collecting stamps, doesn't matter. It's all the same in the end. The same as your emotions, they're all the same. They kind of come around, and they, there's nothing to differentiate any of them really when it comes to the end of it. And then number 4 is sublimation, which, well, I'm doing a review video of The Conspiracy Against the Human Race. If you get the reference, you've already read it. And yeah, that's it's difficult to really describe how it all works, because I imagine the book must have been written over a number of years because of the sheer volume of the research and different ideas and notions. He takes a lot of things from literature, from films, from philosophies, from religions even, like Buddhism. Doesn't really get slagged off in a sense, it just gets labelled as a pessimistic kind of belief system, which it clearly is. And it makes for a good argument. Some of my favourite sections include, he does a kind of analysis of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because one of Ligotti's main argument is that the real horror in the world is us. And if you look at our history, it's definitely true. We just slaughtered the whole planet, and every fucking species that has come across our path has been wiped off the face of the earth. So when we get taken, we deserve it fucking a millionfold at this point. And yeah, in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the basic idea is that, because if you haven't seen the film, which you should, it's great, but it basically, I haven't read the book actually, so I'll do that actually at some point. Yeah, and in the film, basically these aliens kind of come down to Earth, but they don't come down in any form. I'm doing this from memory, so correct me if I'm wrong. But they basically start taking over because they invade other people's bodies, and after a while that they can't, the normal people can't differentiate themselves from the aliens that have taken over their friends and family and whatnot. So you can't really tell a difference. There is something that you can kind of tell because of the way they're kind of zombified, but I think that's just in the film. And yeah, the reason that is so terrifying is because really it makes us uncomfortable, because that which should not be is us in the first place. And Ligotti goes on to argue that that's always been the case, that we were kind of taken out from our own nature, or abandoned by our own nature, really. And like Russ Cole's in True Detective's many monologues, he's basically saying, well, the same arguments basically, but there is, what I mentioned earlier, that Ligotti had a high carb diet, and I found that out because of the book club. It's a YouTube channel's review of The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, and it's it's a satire kind of thing, where he's ripping the piss out of it because of the pessimistic nature of the book. But he goes on to write an actual text in the kind of comments section, or the description of the video, where he claims that the book should be banned because he's worried some 15-year-old depressive might find it and kill himself. Well, if you're going to kill yourself because of a book, do it with mine. In fact, I'll send it to you, and you can wrap it around your arm. And on this wrist, /subscribe, and then send it to me as you're, bleeding to death. And then in one of my other videos, I'll put it on there, and then I'll put a little arrow in the next video, like the popular YouTubers do. And then it'll be like a nice little way for you to go, and it'll give me the press I so desperately need. Because Ligotti doesn't need any more press at this stage. I do, I'm desperate for it. So I'd be willing to, you can blame my book without even reading it if you want, for your suicide, and that'd be totally fine by me. But yeah, in all seriousness, I do get his point, but it's ridiculous to say that any book should be banned. I mean, that thought shouldn't even go into your head. So, but it does leave you feeling very beaten, in a sense. Even for me, when I first read it, there were some moments I thought, this is grim. It's so impressively researched, though, that it kind of blows you away. I mean, it is probably the darkest thing I've ever read. I will say that. But for me, that's like a blessing. I don't want any positive shit in my life anymore. I don't really get the whole optimistic angle of stuff. I just don't really, why are people patting life on the back so much when it doesn't answer any of the questions it poses. So it's like, I don't really see why anyone would, life's great. It's indifferent to you, and it's indifferent in general, I often think that as well, that because of the cosmos being as indifferent as it is, that's actually what makes us indifferent to each other in a weird way. I think that's what makes us cope, because, if you really look at the way the world works and how people treat each other, it's fucking awful. And there must be some kind of cosmic indifference going on that makes us, because it's like the kind of studies show that if one person dies, then it's a tragedy, but if it's a fucking 1,000, then it's just a statistic. And I think that's very true, and we kind of turn a blind eye to everything, mainly because we have to, because you wouldn't be able to cope with the, amalgamation of awful shit that happens on this planet every fucking day. You couldn't cope with that in the normal day-to-day world. So yeah, you can probably tell I'm a big fan of this book by this point. I thought I'd review it first, because it makes sense to me to review it first. I've read it probably more than any other book, especially a non-fiction one. I recommend it to anyone, but if you are going through some rough shit, I would be cautious about reading it, because it's not easy reading such grim material at times, and it can depress the fuck out of you. Even worse, not in a sense that, oh yeah, I'm going to grab the rope and hang myself, but because it's ridiculous. I think the whole thing, as an aside, the whole thing about depressives being suicidal, even though that's a given, a lot of us aren't going to kill ourselves, mainly because it's already too late for us. If you are a pessimist, you kind of realise that life is inherently meaningless, so you kind of just get along with it. I think suicide is for optimists who've had a bad or rough month, basically, and they've kind of lost that spark that they once lived with, and therefore, and a lot of the time it's a positive decision to make, because it clarifies your thoughts. It gives you a kind of catharsis, in a sense. The thought of ending it all suddenly then everything's gone. All your problems are gone. So you don't need a depressive book to convince you to do that. I mean, there's far more books that will make you want to kill yourself. Like anything that's trying to make you be positive, or see the power behind positive thinking and all that kind of stuff. It's just or believing the universe actually gives a shit about you. It's it doesn't make any sense to me that what kind of poppycock bullshit do people believe just to get by? It's astounding. But yeah, another part that I really loved was, the ego death. It kind of has a section where people have had this kind of odd experience, either with a brain damage or possibly from a stroke or something like that, where a part of their brain has kind of switched off, and they've seen the world in this kind of, and they call it like an ego death experience, where you just kind of are, or you, and that's it. You know, you don't really think of yourself as a person or a personality or a soul or anything like that. You just kind of exist in the moment. So I guess it must feel like almost like consciousness outside of your body in a sense, but also unrelated to any experience you've had before. So it's just a kind of clear thought. I mean, it sounds heavenly, but I don't think it's attainable very easily. Maybe with kind of DMT or something, but you know, the problem with it being drug induced is it's drug induced. So you know, you're probably not going to remember much of it or really be able to describe it after. And then that's more kind of metaphysical anyway, I think. Whereas this is more, you kind of clearly seeing through it. And Ligotti has a problem with the way a lot of these kind of pessimistic movies and books and whatnot, how they betray their own philosophy right at the end, because you know, you've got to have a nice little positive outlook on it in the end. And he slags off a lot of philosophers for that as well. Nietzsche being one of the main ones. Is some of my favourite sections include him giving Nietzsche a bit of a fucking real slamming, and it's hilarious. Some of it's really funny as well, I find, because it's so bitter, and there is a black humour to it, to me anyway. A few of the other reviews I read don't see the humour in it, but I think it's hilarious. He compares us to being puppets, without any reference to Pinocchio, which I found odd, considering the irony of Pinocchio wanting to be a real boy, but then if he was a real boy, he'd still be a puppet. So yeah, that's it. I'm going to call this my first edition review of this book, because despite reading it numerous times, I do get different things out of it pretty much every time I've read it. So maybe I'll do it again, I don't know. I have heard it was updated in the latest publication of it. I doubt that much, but yeah, if anyone's read it, if there's any distinguishing differences that you noticed, please let me know. Yeah, it's one of my favourite books. I can't really say anything negative about it, apart from maybe, yeah, if you are depressive, then don't, doesn't matter. Just read it. It's a challenge, and it's very well researched as well. Like, the arguments in it really vary. It's almost like a scrapbook in a weird way, but it does flow. Yeah, it uses so many different kind of, it goes from literature to movies to philosophies, you know, like I mentioned, but all within this kind of same realm, and all not. So it's all kind of it's impressive, basically. It's really impressive, and it's remarkably well written. And I don't really blame Pizzolatti or Pizzolotto, or what the fucking name is, for stealing it ad verbatim, because you can't really improve, you know. If you can't improve on the best, then just steal from them, I guess. Something like that. I'm completely misquoting that quote, but never mind. And yeah, the problem with the book is, once you read it, there's no going back from it. Once you realise what a useless non-entity you really are, there's no unlearning there.